Let me go ahead and introduce Dan DeCloss, the CEO and founder of PlexTrack. PlexTrack is one of the sponsors, and they've got a great booth over there. Secure Ideas, used them for a while. Great program, strongly recommend. Dan's going to be talking to us. I honestly don't remember. Are we really making a difference? Dan, it's all you.
All right, thanks everybody, and thanks for getting up early on a Friday morning here at Way West in San Diego, and thanks everybody to Zoom that's joined us online. So I'm going to make this the shortest presentation ever. We were joking last night. Hey, should we just answer the question now and then get 49 minutes back, right? Like, let's just say, hey, maybe. So, no, I'm just kidding. Like, that's not the agenda for today. And I realized that as I converted this, there's a little bit of a typo here. But the agenda is just kind of introduce some stuff that I've been pondering on over the last several years, and wanted to kind of put it together in a presentation. Things that I've observed in the industry, and as we come together as an industry. So, kind of want to talk about, like, hey, what's the problem? I always try to approach things in security about what problem are we trying to solve, right? And approach it from a programmatic perspective. Kind of do some introspection as an industry of how we're doing, how we're making progress, and how will we get better? How will we continue to get better as time goes on? And then I'd like to open it up for thoughts and discussion. I think it's kind of an interesting discussion for sure. But so to start, I think it's important to kind of tell my story as to why I've been getting to this perspective, right? So I started in cybersecurity. I've been in cybersecurity my entire career. I went to the Naval Postgraduate School and was accepted into their program called the Scholarship for Service program back in 2005. And I was really excited. I've always been kind of a mission-oriented person, right? So I felt like, hey, I am destined for this. I'm going to come in and just be a superhero in the security industry. I found a calling, and I'm going to be able to, like, make a difference in the world. And so I loved going to graduate school. I started my career in the Department of Defense, and was like, yes, this is what I'm made to do, right? And so I was very excited about, actually making a difference in society and in the world. As I started my career, I started to get exposed to everything that's going on, and I then kind of turned into this sense of dread, like, oh my goodness, there's a whole new world out there, and there's a lot of problems and things that I didn't recognize that we couldn't solve, right? So went through this period of, like, oh my goodness, how are we ever going to make a difference? How are we ever going to get ahead in the security space? So this period of time took me into, like, okay, what are the things I can focus on? So I actually found my niche in penetration testing, specifically in application security penetration testing. And that, led me on a journey to start identifying things that I was really frustrated about in the security space. One thing that I hated the most was I would come back, and maybe some in this audience have experienced this, probably have a lot. I hated coming back to the same customer or the same client a year after year after year and reporting the same things that we had found previous years, right? And it's like, when will you ever listen? When I was in the DoD, we would do a lot of compliance testing, right? So it wasn't necessarily penetration testing. It was more just like vulnerability scanning, and we provide these reports. These were big organizations, had lots of IP addresses and assets. So we would do a sampling, right? Like anybody, like statistically, it's like, okay, give me a sampling of this is back in the day. So, like, give me a sampling of your Windows 2008 servers, give me a sampling of your workstations, those kinds of things, network devices. So we would extrapolate, hey, we tested 10% of the environment. So we would assume that of the vulnerabilities we found within that 10%, just extrapolate that to the whole and go fix the whole. But instead of fixing the entire organization, they'd only fix what we reported, right? So it got very frustrating because we tried to communicate, like, no, this is just a sampling, right? You should go fix everything. You should explore everything. We don't have time in 1 week to assess the entire environment that way. And so there was a breakdown in communication, a breakdown in follow through. as I progressed into, the private sector, would recognize, obviously, that people are just checking a box sometimes. But I loathed not feeling like I was making a difference, not feeling like, hey, after I report something, how do we actually get this fixed? And how do we actually show that we're moving forward? And that was actually a large motivation for why I started PlexTrack. This is not a vendor pitch or anything like that, but I think it's important to kind of put the perspective of, I really became determined. Like, I actually want to try and make a difference, and I want to provide a way for people to focus on the right things and be able to show progress over time and actually get better at security. And how do we as an industry come together and stay focused on the things that matter, and not focused on menial things like copying and pasting into Word documents and resizing screenshots and things like this. And so that was really the impetus for how we got to where I am today. But by no means have I felt like we've made progress, but I think, we've made progress, but by no means do I feel like we've accomplished what we've set out to do, right? And so this has kind of been my journey and things that I've just started to observe over the last 17 plus years. I'm excited to be involved in the community. By no means do I feel like I have the only perspective, obviously, but it's exciting to me to at least be at a state in the security space where we can actually continue to collaborate on what are we focused on? What should we be focused on? So I always like to kind of start out like, what is the problem, right? I think it's easy to focus on a lot of different things, but sometimes I think that in the security industry, we're our own worst enemies, right? I think that we tend to get caught up on a lot of technical things and not recognizing why we're doing what we're doing. What I like to say, we have a lack of focus on the right problems, right? In security, what is the ultimate goal, and are we asking the right questions? We get desensitized. I think as a society in general now, starting my career early on, we were always trying to convince people like, hey, the bad things can happen. And then they happened, and now we're trying to convince people why it's important to actually fix the things that are going on. I think we've been a little bit desensitized to breaches and leaks as a society, which makes it even harder, I think, from our industry perspective of, are we focused on fixing these things, and what should we be focused on in terms of getting people better? So what I think is hard is to determine what are the long-term effects of a breach, right? For smaller organizations and startups and small businesses, a breach can be devastating, right? For larger organizations, it's certainly a black eye. The first breach probably isn't going to ruin them. Multiple breaches might, but as we've seen over time, companies like Target and Home Depot and Anthem Blue Cross, I mean, they're still doing fine, right? And these are some of the largest breaches in their eras, right? So it's hard and difficult to see what the actual impact of a breach has been over time. And so then it leads to the question, well, does it make a difference? Does it matter what we're doing? So I think that's kind of the point of what we're trying to focus on today is, what is the problem that we're trying to solve, and are we making a difference, and are we making progress, and where are the shortcomings, and what can we do to fix those? So when I think about my time in cybersecurity, and I'm sure you can feel the same way, it definitely starts to feel overwhelming, right? From a Ciso perspective, this is the Ciso Mind Map that I think is not meant to be read, just visualized, right? These are all the things that a Ciso would have under his or her purview when they're building out a cybersecurity program, right? It doesn't matter how big the organization is. These are the topics that come and they get inundated with, regardless of what size of an organization you are or a size of a team that you're building. I think we are inundated with buzzwords in the industry. People get inundated with alerts. There's lots of tooling, which I have another slide here to kind of visualize that as well. Vendors, I think the good and the bad about where we've made progress in the security space is that there's a lot of investment now in cybersecurity, and I think Haroon Mir has a great perspective of like, hey, we need to be careful about the snake oil versus actual progress and tooling that is actually going to make us better. So that's the downside of having a lot of investment in cybersecurity today. The good side is that we actually have investment to actually solve some of the harder problems that take time and take money. And then people get inundated with, should I have certifications? I read a LinkedIn post just yesterday that there's something like over like 300 security certifications available to industry professionals today, and most of them are paid, right? So the security certification industry is making a lot of money off of people trying to get into security, and is that making a difference or not? So there's definitely this sense of being overwhelmed if you're on the blue team, right, or an internal red team. Lots of things to focus on, lots of distraction, and this sense of where should I start, or how do I know if I'm making progress in anything. Another example is, here's the Momentum cyber landscape. This doesn't actually include all the solutions that exist for all of these different types of problems, right? Or what vendors tell us we have problems for, right? So this is a list of like as many companies as you can think of for each type of domain. And I know that not every company is listed here, right? So when we have to remain focused on a lot of these, it starts to distract us from what problems we're actually trying to solve. So when we talk about how are we doing, I kind of want to start backwards. Typically you start like the good, the bad, the ugly. I'm going to go from the ugly, the bad, the good, because I like to end with good things. My perspective, right? And I think I actually put out a poll on social media that I've got all the results for. We won't read through them all, but I wanted to have them in the deck so that they could, as we distribute the slides, we can put them out there as well. But here's some things that I think are wrong in the security space, both the ugly and the bad, right? I think there are definitely a lot of egos in the security space, not everybody, and definitely I don't think in this crowd. I think that the Wild West Hackin Fest crowd specifically is void of egos for the most part. But this has been a detriment over time, right? It has deterred people that are very smart to actually get into the space and try to solve the hard problems. And that leads to exclusivity, right? You do have a mentality of, hey, I was at DEF CON 1 or I was at DEF CON 6, and I have just a different air about me. And I'm not saying me personally, this is how I've seen people behave because I wasn't at DEF CON 6. There's this sense of like, well, I was there from the beginning and I know a lot more than everybody else, right? So I'm just gonna do my own thing and look and really treat people with contempt. And I've had it done to myself. I'm sure a lot of other people have as well. And I think there's one thing that's true about technologists in general, but definitely in the security space, is that we tend to have imposter syndrome, right? We tend to not feel confident in the things that we know and the things we can do, and that's to our detriment as an industry. There's definitely a lack of empathy. When we talk about red teaming or penetration testing or the offensive side of security, there's definitely a lack of empathy that I've seen over the years for the blue team side, right? If you've not been on a blue team, I definitely encourage you to try it because there is so much else going on within a single organization that it's hard to recognize all the challenges that a blue team is facing outside of the technical vulnerabilities and risks that are getting reported to them, right? Things like political structure within the organization, people problems, all kinds of other things going on in their daily work that distract them from being able to focus on security risks and vulnerabilities. And then a couple things that have, I think, been highlighted more recently that I think is really important. And I wanted to make sure I had a pause for this. I think we do tend to put our identity as who we are as people and individuals into our work. This is common amongst all humans, I think, but specifically in this space, I think mental health is becoming a problem, right? And I think it's been talked about before, and I mean, I'm not going to speak for everybody, and I think everybody's going to have their own opinions on this, but I do think that some of that stems from putting our identity into our jobs and not the relationships that we're building throughout society and throughout our work. Which can lead to mental health problems. I'm just saying, I'm just recognizing there is a problem there. I'm not going to state everybody's that this is a global thing or this is how we solve it. I just think that it's important for us as an industry to recognize that we should reach out to friends, right, and colleagues and just ask how they're doing, right, outside of work. So this is some of the ugly stuff, and I think we've lost a lot of people in the space due to mental health issues, and so it is a problem, right? So going from the ugly to the bad, these are kind of more tactical things. I think definitely within organizations we have a lack of stakeholder support. There's little to no collaboration sometimes between people that are on the proactive side of security and the people that are on the defensive side of security. It's a lot. It can be very confusing and overwhelming for blue teams to get inundated with a 300-page pen test report or a vulnerability scan that has 1,000 findings, and how am I supposed to know what to do with this, right? And who's going to help me figure this out? And so there's this lack of communication in general between the different teams that are identifying the issues and the teams that are tasked to go resolve the issues, as well as be able to communicate up the chain, right? So I think that communication is a big factor in how we move forward as an industry. Being able to communicate clearly what are the risks and what is the impact to the business is always very important. We're definitely more reactive than proactive as an industry, especially on the blue team side. I think, when we talk about penetration testing, that's a very proactive activity. But for the most part, on the blue team, they're starting their organization, they're starting their program with a SIM, they're starting how to identify alerts, and then they spend 90% of their time, one, keeping the SIM up and running or configuring it, and two, trying to just reduce the amount of alerts that are coming into an organization. So that's not a very proactive activity. It's a very reactive activity. When I was a security director, I tried to actually allocate, hey, 70% of our time for now, as we're getting started, we're going to spend on reactive processes, reactive things, and more legacy issues. But then we're going to spend the other 30% of our time focused on proactive activities. How do we make sure we're avoiding some of these things before they become legacy issues? And then other things like, simple things like unicorn job descriptions, right? We see organizations putting out job descriptions for entry-level security jobs that require a CISSP or 5 years of experience, and that's becoming a detriment to how we make progress and get more people into the space and into security as well. So these are some of the things that I recognize, are not new to anybody, but I think it's important to continue to call them out as we move forward. Some other things as well. We tend to get caught up in petty arguments, college versus no college, degree, certifications, how many should I have, which ones should I have? I like this one because I may get thrown off the stage, but like, what is the definition of red teaming? I think, okay, that's fine. Let's have that discussion, but is it really worth our time to discuss, what a red team engagement is versus a pen test and all these things? And it's like, that's fine to have a healthy conversation about it, but let's not get wrapped around the axle about these things, right? And I think we do tend to, as a society, or as an industry, put ourselves into silos. The hackers definitely get glorified. The pen testing side of the house definitely tends to get exalted, and and then there's everybody else, right? There's the identity and access management folks. There's the SOC, and there's the vuln management folks, there's the AppSec folks. There's a lot of work going on in the security space that is not penetration testing and red teaming, right? And I think if there's one thing you want to take away from this, is that those people are working very hard and have a lot of issues to resolve, and are overwhelmed at times, right? So I think it's important that we at least stay focused on the right things, and let's not get wrapped around the axle of arguments and discussions that don't move the needle forward in security. Okay, so how do I think we're doing in terms of the good? I think we're definitely maturing rapidly as an industry. from an industry perspective, we're very immature in general, right? Probably, realistically, 20 to 30 years worth of growth in the space is not that long. When you think about other industries like the financial sector, the legal sector, there's lots of time that has been to mature how you observe the growth and the risks associated with each industry. So I think we are rapidly maturing, right, which is good and bad. The amount of transformation and technology that has grown over the last 20 years is really impressive, and we're solving quick problems in a good way. I think we are doing better at proliferating knowledge of what we do as an industry and how we get that knowledge disseminated to people that are not in our organization. I think early on, everybody was very tight-lipped about techniques and things that they're doing in their organization to solve problems, and I think we've made good progress there in terms of being able to share that information without disclosing confidentiality or breaking confidentiality and privacy. I think we are continuing to collaborate for the future. How do we continue to get better as an industry, as a whole, as a quote unquote larger purple team, so to speak? And we're solving challenging problems. These are not easy problems to solve. How do you prevent continued exploits that are oop, does that be? Sorry, there's a didn't know if I stepped somewhere that I shouldn't have stepped. And I think one thing this is really exciting to me is that I think that the people that get into security and stay in security are very mission oriented, because it is a challenging job, right? And I think the folks that tend to stay in the industry truly have the right motivation. It's not always about them and about their progress in their career, but truly trying to make a difference in the world. And this is the way that we can do it. So those are some things that I have recognized are very good about the progress that we're making, that we've made over the last 17 years that I've been in the space. So I kind of mentioned that I put out a little bit of poll because this is my perspective, having been in the space and talked to a lot of people and had multiple roles, because I've been in both sides of the fence in terms of the red team side and the blue team side. But I wanted to kind of see, like, okay, we see a lot of these discussions online, but like I just put out a random poll earlier in the week just to kind of see what other people think. So I just said, hey, I'm just getting some feedback. What are the things that you love about the industry, and what are the things that annoy you about the industry? I put this out on Twitter and LinkedIn. Twitter tends to get a little bit, more response. And so it was assuring and concerning all at the same time, right? So I think anytime people are going to respond to something like this, they're always going to kind of lean towards the negative. It's like when you put out a survey for like, hey, how are we doing? Most people that are happy are not going to like respond, and the people that aren't happy are going to tend to make a comment, right? So we won't read through all of these, but I highlighted some of the good ones that I think are important and kind of validated some of the things that I've been seeing as well. So definitely ego was one of the first ones that came out. People really treating other people with contempt is a problem. The lack of empathy, and I think that kind of highlights the red team not necessarily understanding what the blue team is going through, but also vice versa, right? The blue team tends to say like, okay, these are jerks, right? I'm tired of them always breaking in and never feeling like we're getting anywhere. But in reality, red teaming is hard too, right? Being able to identify what are the new techniques and tactics that we should be testing, how do we communicate those effectively to the organization? And then, she mentioned Twitter drama. These ones are kind of long, but in general, one of them highlighted that entry-level jobs have a lot of unrealistic job expectations. This other one on the left, identified that, hey, we're not really viewing ourselves the way that we actually sit in the industry and in what our actual role is. And these will be available later, so you can read through these. They're memorialized now, but they were on social media. But I like what Jeff said in terms of the good, right? There's always new problems to solve, and it's an exciting industry to be in. and let's see, there's opportunity and it's growing, and there's a continued recognized need for the jobs that we're filling. This one was interesting as well. Highlighting that there's not a true partnership within the organizations that's really the main focus, whether you're a consulting firm testing against organizations or internal to the organization. Is there true partnership across the org? And then being able to work on challenging problems again, right? And then good friend Casey Ellis, we're here because we're intrigued by the attackers, right? That they are coming up with fascinating things, and how do we continue this cat and mouse game to identify what are the things that we should be doing to fix, and how do we identify what their next steps are, right? The bad, I think this is important because it'll come up later, but the trailing indicators are what we focus on rather than the leading indicators. So, getting better metrics and good data in the organization is actually really critical. Not really having an emphasis on, what moves the needle forward, and that's what we're going to talk about here in a second. But the snake oil marketing is also interesting as well. Casey, being another founder of a security company, is like, hey, they're trying to actually achieve a mission to do better things, and they tend to get, people tend to get distracted with the snake oil rather than, the solutions that actually might help them succeed. So I think that's important. And then Bryson, who will be speaking later today, the bad perfectionist for the 1% nerd solutions for nerd problems. I thought that was a funny one. Because I think it's important, hey, you can soak up a lot of time solving a specific problem that is very interesting, but maybe not really that relevant, to the industry as a whole. So where our time management goes is important. Not being able to speak to the business, I think, and understand the impact of the work that we're doing in business terms, because at the end of the day, if we're working for an organization, especially in the private sector, that has an impact on the bottom line, right? And so how do we reflect what we're doing as it is related to the bottom line? For other organizations like government organizations, are we focused on what we're achieving for the true mission, right? So. From the positives, the community is great, right? The community is solid, and there is a lot of collaboration out there, and the people are what make that community great. And then, being able to focus on the up and coming security professionals as well. And then the last one I thought was funny and relevant. It does just really come down to people, right? At the end of the day, for both the bad and the good, it ends up being the people. So we spent quite a bit of time highlighting maybe things that aren't new to anybody, definitely perspective that I've had, and how I've progressed in my career as well, and continuing to want to stay mission oriented. So how do we land the plane, and move forward, or what are some takeaways, right? So I always try to make sure, hey, don't just highlight problems. Let's talk about the solutions and how we get better. So in general, how do we suck just a little bit less, right? How do we make just a little bit of progress over time? And I think that's an important perspective to have. It's let's not get caught up on what perfect looks like. Let's just start with good and move from there. Many people in my organization will recognize that I tend to say, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. I say that all the time. How do we make sure we're making progress and moving forward and not getting wrapped around axles, right? So it's always important to ask the hard but the right questions. I alluded to this earlier, but as an organization, if you're an internal team, it's important to say, will my company go out of business, if we're breached, or will what's the worst thing that can happen? That's not always an easy question to answer, and I kind of alluded to it before. Of smaller organizations, yeah, it could be pretty devastating. Larger organizations, it's going to hurt, and over time we may have other indicators of what a breach has over the last, like in 20 or 30 years. But on the whole, large organizations going to have more money, going to have more budget, going to have more resiliency against breaches. The first one may hurt, second one may be more devastating. It may take 2 or 3 or 4 before it really becomes a problem for them to say like, hey, we've really got to get a handle on this, or they'll go out of business. Does my company, truly care about security? Comes back to that age-old problem of like convincing stakeholders, hey, do we have buy-in from the top? And then why should we care, right? Like, I think these are good questions to keep asking so that you start to stay focused on the right problems for your organization. We could talk all day long about things that are good for an organization or things that are good, in general, but at the end of the day, everything's going to be unique to your organization. There's going to be principles and fundamental things that you want to get into place, but if that's not going to move the needle forward for your organization, focus on what will. And that takes some dedicated time of just asking these questions as a team. Why should we care? What is the purpose of our organization? What is the purpose of our team? And what does great security look like for us? I think we saw a quote the other day, like, we tend to talk about like, let's see, I don't want to butcher it here. So, what am I best at? As opposed to, shoot, now I'm going to mess it up. What am I best at versus how do I, where am I my best, right? So I think it's important to kind of stay focused on, I'm my best when, as opposed to what am I best at. Okay, so these are the hard but the right questions to be asking of our organizations. If you're a consulting firm, these are important things to be working with your organizations or your customers on getting truly to the bottom. And so, like, how do we maybe make a little bit of a shift to answer some of these questions? I think it always starts with data. We tend to not like metrics, and I think we focus on a lot of the wrong metrics. Today, I think a lot of organizations tend to focus on metrics around how many vulnerabilities we just have in our environment. Those are point-in-time metrics rather than trends and analysis. But what gets measured gets done, right? And so if you start from a data-centric approach of like, hey, what are the key metrics we want to provide at the end of the day? What are the KPIs that we want to show as our team, whether we're an internal vulnerability management team, or an AppSec team, a SOC, or a pen testing team? Because pen testing teams should have metrics as well, right? I think it's easy to just deliver reports all day long and tell people what's wrong and good luck go fixing those. But is that actually helpful, right? And I think that the good organizations and the good consulting firms are the ones that are actually going to help their customers get better. So some examples, SLAs, on pen test findings specifically. If pen tests are the most concentrated level of risks that you're identifying for an environment, shouldn't those be called out separately? I mean, that's a question, right? Should those in your environment be called out a little bit differently than vulnerability findings from scans, right? Or AppSec findings from code scanners. So maybe put some SLAs on pen test findings and be able to highlight how quickly you're getting those resolved and how quickly those might be changing over time. I think if there's one thing that we've identified is that the criticals and highs tend to get focused on a lot when they come out of even a vulnerability scan, but a pen test specifically. But those mediums and those lows tend to, over time, elevate into criticals and highs, but you may not have as deep of a handle on those findings over time. So being able to centralize those and identify, hey, what are the trends over time? How are we resolving highs versus mediums? How often are these moving into highs is an important metric. I think coming into test plans from a threat and or TTP coverage perspective is where we're headed as an industry as well, and I think it's good. If we can focus on, hey, as an industry, we're in the healthcare sector, what are the primary threats that we have to our environment, and can we provide threat-informed test plans accordingly, right? So as opposed to, we did a webinar the other couple weeks ago, and we focused on this topic a little bit in terms of, hey, as a red team or a pen testing team, is it as valuable to just have carte blanche, or is it actually more valuable to say like, hey, we want to emulate these types of threats as as providing a little bit more value to, these are known things that an organization should be able to fix. Otherwise, pen testers and red teamers by nature are going to kind of revert to the same tactics that always work, right? So it stretches the testing team a little bit to say like, hey, no, we really need to simulate this type of a threat actor and actually simulate these techniques versus just having carte blanche. The carte blanche can still be valuable, to identify bigger gaps, but at least you're providing an organization with a roadmap, right? And so something to think about: how much coverage do we have with these attack techniques? MITRE ATT&CK framework is a great resource for that. And then I think building things up into a program, perspective. As a blue team, everything's related to what are the programs we're effectively, are initiating today, whether that's an identity management program, an AppSec program. So how do we speak in terms of risk related to the different programmatic areas in our environment? Let's continue to collaborate, not just between the red and the blue teams, but in teams outside of those organizations. I quoted Landon, who is actually our VP of product, because we were having a discussion the other day, and I was kind of telling him about my talk, and he's like, "Oh, so he comes straight from product. He's not had as much exposure to the security space till joining us, and built great products for other big organizations." And he said, like, yeah, we would get these results from the security team and didn't know what to do with them, right? And where does that fit within the product roadmap that they have? Like, everybody's busy, right? Everybody has their own initiatives. And so having just a slight amount of empathy of like, how can we work together to get these resolved was important to him. And I mean, it seems obvious, but I think it's important because it's clearly not always happening, right? And that security teams, for whatever reason, it's not necessarily, hey, I don't want to help them. I think it probably comes down to a lack of good communication. How do we effectively, get the message across? Like, these are important. Here's how we can help you fix them, right? So being able to collaborate throughout the organization, not just within our internal security teams, is important. I think it's always important to talk about feeling overwhelmed. Is like, you do need to anticipate defeat. You're gonna get breached. That's an if, or that's a when, not an if. Security is a journey. I'm a baseball player by nature, by growing up, and so I used to coach baseball. And so, I was trying to put it in perspective of like a Hall of Fame baseball player is going to fail 70% of the time, right, or succeed 30% of the time. Now, I'm not saying like, hey, that's the benchmark for us as in security, but I think it's an important litmus test of like, what are the things that we really should give ourselves some grace, and where should we really focus and hunker down? And like, hey, we need to have 100% coverage, or as much coverage as possible on the crown jewels, right? Things that are most critical to our environment, and how are we working both red and blue to make sure that those are as locked down as possible. And then what are the things on the edges that we'll get to later, and continue to prioritize and anticipate that we're going to have some failures there, right? And then just continue to act with purpose. Understand what the vision and the mission is for your organization within the security team and the company as a whole, or if a government agency or whatever. Being able to identify like, this is where the train is going. We're all rowing, or it's a bad analogy. We're all moving in the same direction, right? Continue to be better mentors. This comes back to Bryson's comments about, hey, being able to raise up the next generation is important. We always know we're going to have a gap. This is a very technical field. It's not easy to get into just simply from it takes time to understand how things work. There's very few people that pick up on it right away. And so people come into the space. I always say, like, I got into security the most formal way I've ever heard of, right? Like, most people did not go to college and graduate school to get into cybersecurity. That's very, very rare, and I feel very blessed. But we all recognize that's not how people are going to continue to get into security. How do we continue to train them up and build up the next generation? Educate without contempt. I think this kind of comes back to that empathy and ego perspective. Don't treat people, less than you, right? I mean, it's kind of a general human concept, but I think it's important in the security space as well. And continue to give back. This is why I love working with the with Black Hills and Wild West Hackin Fest team. They're just such fantastic people in general. Like, we just love working with them, but they always give back, right? They're not focused on, having everything be around, making a profit or whatever, but truly making the world a better place. And so I think if we come at it with that mentality, that's important. I think it's important to promote diversity. This is not a joke. I think if you, kind of have seen the distribution of people in the security space, there's definitely not as much diversity as there needs to be. I think that's a common topic. I just wanted to memorialize that. Like, this is really important. The broader perspectives that we have, the better we're off, the better off we are. So continue to focus on that. Celebrate your progress, the big and the small wins. This boosts morale. I know from some of the wins that we celebrate within PlexTrack, when we get organizations that are saying like, hey, our team just has better morale because we got more done. That's important, right? Celebrate those kinds of things and don't overlook them. And make sure that you do focus on, these are the metrics we're driving to. And when we have the small wins, and celebrate those and make that important, because it's easy to get caught up on the breaches and the attacks and the incidents and how do we, what did we do wrong? And as opposed to focusing on what have we done right? What are the things that are going well? And then, how do we continue to emphasize those as we move forward? And then I think, kind of coming back to that notion of the mental health aspects. Don't put your identity in your job. Like, this is important. It's good for you to have, a mission at hand, but take time for yourself. Take time for your relationships, whoever those are, friends, family. Take time for yourself. Take time for others. Relationships do matter most of all, and keeping things in perspective helps keep everybody healthy and driving towards the right things and not getting burnt out. I think is important, because I think it's easy to see in security that we do have an industry with a propensity to get burnt out, and that's not gonna work long term. So that was a very jam-packed session, but to kind of land the plane finally, like, I would definitely say, like, absolutely, we are making a difference. There's a lot of great things going on in the security space, especially on the red team side and the blue team side. And we've made a lot of progress. Sure, there's lots of warts along the way. And so how do we continue to stay focused on getting better while celebrating the wins? I definitely feel like we are making a difference, and appreciate everybody's time. Happy to open it up for discussion, and if there were any questions online. So.
Thanks, Dan. There was one question that came in from Discord. Are you familiar with the Navy's Cyber Ready program? Have you heard anything about that?
I have not.
Okay, so they asked what you thought about it. I'll just quick summary. Basically, the Navy has announced, hey, focusing on compliance and trying to keep everything in check is not working. So we're going to shift towards continuous monitoring, ongoing risk assessments, like constant stuff, and just focus on trying to stay ahead of things rather than focus on audits and compliance and all that kind of stuff. And so somebody just asked if you have any thoughts on that and the impact.
I think that's the right progression, right? I think there's things that aren't working, and we all know there's that I don't want to kind of get like, hey, there's that wrapped around the like security compliance argument, but at the end of the day, what problem are we trying to solve? We're trying to avoid being breached, right? And so when we know what we're testing for, being in a continuous mode, that's the right way forward. So I completely agree, and I think that is the right next step in evolution for us all. Yeah. Yes.
Something you mentioned earlier in your talk, you were leading a security.
Yeah, that's great. So I'll repeat the question for people online. So earlier I mentioned that when I was a security director, I tried to allocate 70% of our time for the reactive, or what I would also call the legacy issues, versus the 30% on the proactive side. So how we did that was we would spend, we knew, like, coming in, like, every organization, when a security program gets started, there's a lot of other things you got to do just to kind of get going, right? So the goal was start in that kind of allocation. I think actually we started at like 80-20, and then kind of we wanted to move to where it was going to be more 50-50, or eventually just continue to, the math should work out. The more you focus on the proactive stuff, the less legacy things you have, right? So that was the mentality that we brought to it. So with the reactive items, we were focused on, the SIM, getting the SOC ready. We outsourced to an MSSP for like egress monitoring and things like that. Then with the proactive side, we actually went with that purple teaming model. And because we had an internal development organization, we went to like a 2-week sprint cycle where we would say, okay, we're gonna start testing techniques in lateral movement, let's say. Like we feel like we have a gap there, but we don't necessarily know what those techniques are that we're missing. So we'd spend like 2 weeks testing those things as part of that proactive life cycle. And it really was just a discipline in terms of like allocating the time, making sure you have the time, because you can always get caught up in the reactive stuff. But if you actually dedicate the time, you're gonna actually start making progress. So we'd spend 2 weeks. Hey, we tested this set of techniques. It was like small at the beginning, and then we were able to, like, from the blue team perspective, saying, okay, what do we need to configure differently to make this better? And so we actually saw a lot of progress, doing it that way. So the goal was to continue to, spend more time on the proactive side once we felt like we had, a decent handle on some of those reactive issues. Good question. Yes. So the question was related to, burnout, and how do we get better, or how are we making progress in attracting and retaining talent? I think my perspective is it's always going to be hard, right? For a couple of reasons. One, I mean, it is a technical role. It's not something that it's easy to get into, right? I think you do have to, being in security specifically, you have to understand a lot about a lot of things, right? At least when we're talking about small teams in mid-sized organizations, which is going to be a majority, right? If you're in a big company, you might even have 200 people on your security team. So you can have like those more niche focuses, like, hey, I only focus on malware analysis, or forensics, versus I'm a generalist that has to know a little about all of those things, right? So I think being able to focus on how do we make the current teams more efficient and to build morale there is my approach to the best start. Because if people from the outside see that these people burn out every 18 months, you're right. Why do I want to take a job like that, right? So, or they tend to move around. I think a lot of people will tend to bounce out of a blue team into more of a red team type focus, or move from. There's a lot of revolving doors in security today. So I think the focus should be on how do we make sure we're measuring the right things and making the team as efficient as possible, so they have more morale about we're making better progress. That's one approach, right? I think that we have seen work. But then I also think that it's important to just make sure that we are taking care of our people, right? How do we make sure, I think just asking simple questions of like, hey, do you need to take a day off today? Those kinds of things, which is more general to the populace as a whole. I think, unfortunately, my hunch is that COVID also had a huge impact on just the mental state of everybody. So we've got some work to do there. But I think what's important is focusing on the people. How are they doing? It's how can I help? And then when we talk about attracting talent, being able to speak, rational to people, not oversell it, but say like, hey, here's what you're getting yourself into. Here's what I like about it, and here's the challenges that we all have to work through together. Right. So, good question.
One more question here, Dan, from Discord. What are some examples of key metrics or KPIs that teams should focus on, or do you have any tips in general when it comes to selecting metrics?
Yeah, so I think I kind of mentioned some of them earlier, some of the newer ones that I think are important, and as we've talked to like other CISOs and things like that, I think having a distinct metric around your pen test results and in your continuous assessment program, like, are you getting coverage within the threat landscape? So how many techniques have you tested? I think that if there's one like lovely, beautiful thing that has come out recently is the MITRE ATT&CK framework. I love it because it puts it in perspective of how the organization is where they're at in terms of being able to detect those different techniques in the life cycle. So putting metrics around those, how much coverage have we had? How well are we able to detect and block these attack techniques over time? So those are some basic ones. I think you always want to put things in the matter of trends as much as possible. Point in time metrics are pretty graphs, and pie graphs are pretty, but they're not showing they're not providing you much information. So being able to put things into trends, and I think putting it in relative of time, how quickly are we resolving these issues that get reported, and categorizing them a little differently than just straight up vulnerabilities and straight up risks. Great. Well, I think we're good.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Dan. Everybody give Dan a round of applause.
Thank you.